So thank you very much, and I should say it's a pleasure to be here with you today. I want to note that I am not a member of the Parental Alienation Study Group, and some of the views are, I want to say that I have done a lot of research that was mentioned with some psychologists, including Dr. Fiedler, who was here a few minutes ago, Dr. Rachel Birnbaum, Dr. Shelley Polak. So this is an interdisciplinary kind of presentation, but it does not necessarily reflect the views in total of the study group. And as Dr. McCartan very kindly said, I've done different things. One of the things, by the way, on the bottom of this slide is, I'm contributing a chapter to a book that she is co-editing. So I'm very pleased to be working with her. And this was, by the way, the first time we met, so in person. So another thing I just want to mention is I've been involved in judicial education. So I'm someone who has been privileged to talk to judges in a setting like this, a formal setting, in Canada, but also the United States, Australia, New Zealand, and aussi au Quebec. And that's a responsibility and an honor as well. And although I live in an ivory tower, as it so happens, this is, I'm sure you know, some of you, how many of you are parents involved in these cases or grandparents or living through it? And I want to say, I mean, in some ways you're the real heroes here. My email address is at the end. I'm not inviting any emails, but people even not in this room email me a lot and say, I want to talk to you a little bit and so on. So I hear the anguish that parents feel, the concern, the kind of things that we heard about in a few moments ago. And I'm going to be talking in an overview way about different approaches to parental alienation. And in a broad nutshell, I believe that parental alienation is a very valid, important concept. I'm going to talk a little bit about the struggle that we've had in Canada, although I don't live in the trenches the way that Brian Hall does, but I've lived in some of the political trenches, and the recent development that we had in Canada with an attempt to enact legislation to ban parental alienation. That's a big fight, and I was involved a little bit in that, and I'll talk about that. And in particular, many of these issues, there is a gendered element, not so much gender, there are a lot of mothers and fathers, but there's what I would refer to as a radical feminist critique that has influenced things in many jurisdictions, in particular in the United States, but also in Germany. I'm going to respond to that. I'm also going to talk about research that I've been involved with people like Dr. Birnbaum that helps address some of the questions, by no means all of them. And a kind of conclusion here is, who's going to make these decisions in Canada, and I would suggest other countries, and it's the judges, because we trust, by and large, the judges. Doesn't mean judges are always right or judges are always perfect, but in the last session we had, Dr. Fiedler saying, how do we know what the truth is? And all three of those parents would say, well, I know what the truth is because the judge said it was true. Right? In each of their cases, they had a trial, and the judge said that they had been alienated parents and switched custody. Very dramatic cases. That's not always the reality. Often people are sitting in Dr. Fiedler's office, and they never get to trial. So how do people deal with that? And how do you deal with the uncertainty pending trial? Or even worse, what happens if you go to trial, and you say, I'm an alienated parent, and the judge says, I don't think so, right? And how do you deal with that afterwards? So that's a fair bit to cover. And I should say, in this session, I have my eye on my watch. There'll be a time for questions and comments from the floor. Some of the things I'm saying may be controversial. So many of you are familiar with, or at least heard of Dr. Gardner, who developed the concept of parental alienation syndrome in the late 1980s. And he was a very innovative judge, psychiatrist. Some of the ideas can be traced back to earlier people, but he actually coined the term and referred to it as a disorder of the child, and primarily manifests itself in child custody disputes. And I think he was a very innovative thinker and really helped move and create, to some extent, this area. But there were also limitations to his work, so he was controversial. And I should say, and very much in fairness to him and others, he's often maligned. So people, oh, he was a pedophile, or he wanted to encourage pedophilia. That's, I think, completely unfounded. Or he only published self-published books. He had hundreds of articles published in referee journals. But there are also limitations to the work, which is understandable. He's the very first person who started doing significant work. So we look back and say, well, his research, his ideas were based on his cases, so that's a limitation both in terms of who comes to see him, and then it relies to some extent on his perception of it. And at least in most of his writing, he was saying that parental alienation is something that mothers do to fathers. And that was based on what he was seeing. That doesn't mean he wasn't seeing a broad spectrum of cases. He also referred to this as a disorder of the child, and this is an ongoing controversy. Do we call it a mental disorder or a syndrome? And I'll refer back to that a little bit. He also had some pretty, I think, dramatic ideas, and one, intervention. So he said, well, if the child won't go and visit with dad as the court has ordered, then the child should be sent to the child is defying the court order, 12-year-old child, send them to a juvenile detention facility. And there are judges in the United States who've done that, but that's not, by and large, they don't do it in the United States. We don't do it at all in Canada. And so the issue of how do you enforce an order is there still, and we heard some discussion about this, is a major issue, but we don't follow Dr. Gardner's advice. This isn't to say he didn't have a lot of good ideas, but just pointing out there were limitations to his ideas. Now, parental alienation today remains very much a controversial concept, and maybe not with the people in this room, but as I'll point out in a moment and discuss, and some of you are very much aware of this, there's huge controversy in the field, if you want, in the academic community where I live and work. There is a view set out in what I'm going to call the traditional or the parental alienation study group. Bill Burnett, I don't know if is Bill Burnett here somewhere? Okay, and I want to say I disagree with him about some things, but he's a tremendous scholar and gentleman. And one of the things I like is he's always prepared to engage. I disagree with you, Nick, but we'll talk about it. There are other people who say, Nick, I disagree with you, and you should be thrown off the boat. So, but one of his ideas, one of their ideas, and Amy Baker, and some of you may have or have seen what when I will refer to this as the official synopsis of the Parental Alienation Study Group, which is here, I think, available for people. It's free on the internet, and it has a certain perspective. And among other things, it says, well, parental alienation is a disorder, and it should be recognized by the American Psychiatric Association, DSM-5, or now it'll be 6, as a disorder of the child. Okay, it's free for everybody. And so that's still an ongoing question. I'm not a psychiatrist or psychologist. I think there's some problems with calling it a disorder of the child. It's a relational situation. There's also a lot of discussion about the 5-factor model and diagnosing parental alienation. And there are sessions about that here. I think the 5-factor model and their various instruments, the PSAQ, have some value, but they're not definitive. I mean, I think the problems are more complex than some of these writings indicate. I think another element to this is that there's a focus often on, first of all, one party is right and the other party is wrong. The innocent parents and somewhere out there, and they were very positive about saying, I'm sorry that the other parent's like that. The other parent is wrong and I was right. I was good, they were bad. I mean, this yin-yang. And in some cases, that is true. And actually, I've never met these people. I've read about their decisions, and they look pretty far along the extreme, and one can say, yeah, there was right and wrong. It was very, moving how, by the way, how Mr. X said, I called the police. That was a mistake. Maybe I was kind of had some role in this, but it's the model of the PSAG is often on right and wrong, good and bad. And I should say there's very much a mirror image of this I'll talk about in a few moments. The domestic violence community says, yeah, there's a right and wrong, and that's the other side of this. And I think often, though, it was very nice how I think we heard some of this, the child's role in the development of a situation of rejection of a parent is sometimes lost. So that's one spectrum. And the other spectrum is what the critical feminist theory perspective that I'm sure many people have heard of. And in fact, it's in response to this perspective, the red group, that I'm going to be responding to in large part. And over, let's say, the last couple of years, together with some other Canadians, we really pushed back against this. But this is the red side there is very strong in the world as a whole. It's affected the enactment of legislation in a number of jurisdictions in the United States, and largely blue states. And it's, for example, affected the German Supreme Court. And so I'll talk a little bit about that later on. But these critics reject parental alienation as a concept. They say these are the junk science people. This is junk science. So there's huge literature, they're referenced at the end. Again, if you're a parent, you may or may not have read it. If you're a professional, you may have read it, and so I don't agree with that. But they say it's a pseudoscientific concept. And some of their critique, to me, has some value, by the way. One of the things they point out is there's not a specific instrument, psychological test that can say, is this an alienated child or not? Dr. Fiddler, you're the assessor or whoever, is it an alienated child? And the answer is, well, it's a question of judgment of someone like Dr. Fiddler or Dr. Harris, whoever. It is not a question that we can precisely tell. And it is also sometimes misused, and I'll come back and talk about that in our research. There are false claims of parental alienation. Dr. Fiddler saying we don't really know the truth. But this group has had a very strong political and legislative agenda. And in Canada, there was a heavy movement, I'm going to talk about it, to ban parental alienation in the courts. And as I say, fortunately, we were successful in Canada, or maybe we're successful till this point, but in other jurisdictions, this battle is being lost. And a number of American states have enacted various legislation, California, that moves in that direction, and Germany seems to have gone the furthest. So we'll talk about that. This is the battle. This is the controversy. And so people talk about being in the trenches. This is the trench that I'm in. But I should say also, there are these two groups, and to some extent, I would say there's a middle group, the blue group. And so I see myself in the blue group, light blue group, with Dr. Fiddler, Janet Johnson, Michael Saini, and so on. And by the way, these slides, I'm happy to have people take pictures or record. Everyone will get a copy of the slides. Is that, if they want it, is that right? They can get access to these slides later on. Is that correct? Yeah, you can take pictures. It's being recorded. But and key thing, at the end of this is my email address. Send me an email. I'll be happy to send you these slides and papers and so on. So in this middle view, and the literature developed really out of Gardner. There was one side, Burnett, Baker, and so on. There's a middle group who've also written a lot about parental alienation, but see parental alienation as one concept in a range of other concepts, range of other ideas, and recognize that it's complex, multifactorial. There's no single test. One has to look at all the factors. And while some cases should result in a court order reversing custody, most of them can be resolved in some other less intrusive, dramatic way. The courts have a role, but it's not the only role. So that's the sort of the context in which I'm speaking. And I'll talk just to say a little more about sort of the 5-factor model, the Burnett-Baker, and this is where, and the disagreement that I have with the parental alienation study group is not trivial, but I'm sort of, if to go back that slide, if I see myself in the middle group, I'm a lot closer to the PASG side than to the critical feminist side. But it's important to be aware, if you're in this area, whether you're a parent or a psychologist or a lawyer or a judge, to say, you know what, PASG, their views are also controversial, and there's some issues about how they write and talk. And I want to also, in fairness, say it's a diverse group. So it's not, there are some people, not to offend any Americans, it's a bit like the Democratic Party. There are a lot of people out there, they have different views. And they're all say they're Democrats, but they, some of them are more nuanced than others. That's my perception as a Canadian, I should say. Maybe it's not fair. So the issue here is that partly, the terminology, some of them refer to it as a syndrome, some of them don't. They certainly recognize, since Gardner, that often it is mothers who are alienated, the rejected parent. It's not only fathers who are the rejected parent. But they like this 5-factor model. I say there'll be a presentation on it, and the 5-factor model is not useless, but it's certainly, in my view, not definitive. And I should say, my view, people say, "Oh, Bala, you're a lawyer, what do you know about this?" I work with Dr. Fiddler and so on, write with them. And I think there are a lot of psychologists who have concern about some of this approach. And in particular, in the so-called 5-factor model, one of the factors is, well, is the child rejecting the parent because of abuse, neglect, or seriously deficient parenting on the part of the rejected parent? And that sounds, to me, it's like a fairly high test. There may be reasons why children are rejecting a parent that don't rise to that level, and it creates a real concern about what is happening. Another sort of and related factor is a lot of cases are what we call hybrid. It's both parents. And indeed, one of the things, if you're a rejected parent, you have to be asking yourself, and I had a privilege of having spoken to a parent here, just who I'd never met before, said, I thought I was heading to this situation, but I thought I could change the situation somehow. And I couldn't change my former partner, but I could change myself and what I was doing, and how I was interacting with my children, and how I was interacting with my former partner. And that changed the situation. And we didn't end up in court and spending tens of thousands of dollars and so on. So rejected parents can have a role. Is it easy? No. Because you're probably saying, I'm being mistreated by this person, who, by the way, wasn't chosen at random, right? This was somebody who, at one point, you said, "I love you, I want to live with you for the rest of my life," and then you realize things don't work out, and you say, what can I do? And often the tendency is to come to this, what can the judge and police do to change the other person? And that's an important set of questions to ask, but also the question to ask, what can I do as a parent? And as I say, it tends to be a fault-finding model. One parent is alienating, or the other parent is abusive. It's either or, and often it's both. It's very interesting. Mr. Hall, I don't know if Brian Hall is here. He very nicely cited a case that I hadn't seen at the beginning of the presentation. Said, here's a definition of parental alienation. And it's a very nice decision. It summarized what parental alienation is. But when you read the actual decision, the judge says, oh, this is parental alienation. This is intimate partner violence. To me, it's a very helpful decision. But the judge says, you know what? Both the parents were behaving badly. One of them was abusive. The other one was alienating. And I'm not going to say the child's going to spend all their time with one parent or the other parent. The judge had a nuanced understanding or view of the case and said, I'm going to have the child primarily live with the mother. She's going to have sole decision-making. We're not going to worry about getting back and forth. But dad can have significant time, even though he's been abusive. And mom's not going to lose custody, even though she's been alienating. So, and that's the way of many cases. So that I have a bit of concern about, but let me just sort of come back to my theme and what was my role in dealing with the radical feminist critique here in Canada. So in terms of the history of development of ideas, Gardner, Burnett, Baker, that's one stream. It turned out that after Gardner, there were a bunch of other people who wrote about Janet Johnson, Joan Kelly, two American mental health professionals. They're now retired, but they were very influential, and they said it's not a syndrome or disorder of the child. You have to look at all of the circumstances and recognize that in some situations there isn't a child who is one can usefully call alienated, and it's one who persistently expresses unreasonable negative feelings about the other parent. that are disproportionate to their actual experience with the other parent, and it is due primarily, but not exclusively, to the influence of the favored parent. One of the points that they make is, in general, the longer the conflict goes on, the harder it is for the children, and the more likely they are to take sides. So one of the things, if you're in a sort of, or advising parents and so on, to say, you know what, this situation, there's a lot of conflict here. What can I do as a parent to reduce the conflict? Even if I'm the one that's, I have to give up, this is unfair, I have to do this after that, but I'm reducing the conflict, I have to give in, that does seem unfair, but I'm doing it for my child. And by the way, there was a little bit of discussion in here about, religious references. A great reference is the story that many of you know from the Bible of King Solomon. The two mothers, there's a child that's dead and a child that's alive, and the mothers disagree about whose child it is. And King Solomon says, I will cut the child in half. And one mother says, yeah, that's okay. And the other woman says, no, don't do it. She can have the child, okay? And so the one who's prepared to be more reasonable, child-focused, is the one who's going to get custody. And in fact, our judges are often like that. It's hard to believe, but if you actually get to trial, if you've been the more reasonable, child-focused parent and not cranked it up and not pushed back every time someone pressed your button, you're more likely to be successful in court. Your conduct counts. Judges finally get it. You may think, this is outrageous conduct. If you can show that happened, it may be taken into account. And they see a spectrum of conditions there, and I won't go into this slide in a lot of detail, but saying conflict between the parents is an important dimension, the child's reaction is important. Some cases, as they say, are cases of alienation, if you want, unjustified rejection, but there are other cases where it's understandable why the child doesn't want to see a parent, and that might be because of, in the more serious cases, they've been physically, emotionally abused by the parent, but sometimes they're saying, I don't want to go see the other parent. And if you actually drill into it, why not? Well, because my stepbrother who's there is beating me up every time I go there. But doesn't reveal that, and until you drill into that, you say, it may be very reasonable to say, you know what, yeah, you're not going to that house, the stepbrother is beating you up, and how are we going to deal with that? But you're not aware of that until you've drilled into it. And there are many other situations. Another thing there is, affinity, alignment. Sometimes a parent will say, my child used to come and see me every week happily, or every second or whatever, and now they don't want to come and see me as much. They're kind of grumbly. And if you're in a separated family, think, what is going on with this child? And if you're an intact family, say, oh my gosh, it's hard to have teenagers. So sometimes there's a normal developmental part of it's adolescence, and the kid is saying, I'm not seeing the primary residential parent, I'm not seeing the other parent because I'm off with my friends, I'm playing hockey or using drugs or whatever, but I'm not involved with my parents as much. That's not alienation, but it may be affecting the parents, saying they're not seeing me as much. So getting a nuanced understanding. And then this, and again, very busy diagram here, but it says you have to, if you're assessing these cases, first as a court-appointed independent assessor, in Ontario we say Section 30 of the CLRA, you have to look at all the factors. And we sort of heard a little bit touch on this. What was the relationship like between the parents when they were together? What was the cause of separation? What is the personality of the favored parent? What's the personality of the rejected parent? How are they doing as a parent? What is the child like, their age and their temperament? So age is a big part of it. Younger children, 4, 5, 6, can often go back and forth between parents who are not getting along well. But as the child moves towards late school age or early adolescence, they start to develop more of an integrated personality, and they say, I can't stand going back and forth between these two people. Like when I'm with mom and she says, we hate dad, the child starts saying, yeah, we hate dad, and then the child goes to dad, we hate mom, and the child says, oh yeah, we hate mom. If you're 6, you can kind of do that. But by the time you're 10 or 12, you say, hey, what's going on here? I have to choose a side. I mean, they don't think that concretely, but that's what's happening. So the child's age is an important factor. Siblings may really affect what's going on. and older siblings may influence younger siblings. And certainly, what are different professionals doing? So, and I was so impressed by Mr. Hall, when he said, as I'm a lawyer, I sit down and say to someone, you have to, be child-focused and realistic and think about what's going on and not harm your child. And I wish every lawyer in the world, but certainly in Ontario, would say, that's my approach. But a lot of lawyers would say, come and tell me what's going on. And if you say that you have been abused, that's it. You're abused, we're going to prove it, we're going to make sure the other person never sees the child. Or if you say you're alienated, that's it. We're going to prove alienation. And they crank it up. And it may help if the parent is seeing a therapist. You think you've been abused? Where have you been? I've been to the shelter. And why did you go to the shelter? I didn't have a place to live. And what did they say when you got to the shelter? Have you been abused? And if you say no, they say, well, then you can't come in. But if you say, yes, I have, they say, you can have a place to stay for a couple of months. You and your kids are welcome here. Tell us about the abuse. Are you sure you haven't told us anything? You crank people up. So therapists, agencies, sometimes more or less unconsciously are cranking people up on both sides. And so what is the role of all those people? So that's the kind of factors that they look at in a complicated way. Now I'm coming to my real story here. Okay, so that's the background. What happened in Canada and in the last couple of years. Many of you, how many of you are aware of the report of the special rapporteur? So I'll just say a little bit about this. The United Nations has people called special rapporteurs, and for different kinds of issues. And special rapporteurs are actually appointed by some subcommittee of the United Nations, and they go off and do whatever they think is right. And in this case, she wrote a report. Reem Al-Salem wrote a report about parental alienation. But she is not the United Nations. But people, and you'll see in a moment, people say, United Nations says this. No, it's some low-down official. Now, if you're Donald Trump, you say, with all respect to my American friends and colleagues, if you work for the American government, you say what I want. But if you're at the United Nations and you're out there as a special rapporteur, you get a budget and you can go off and say whatever you want. And it's not just this one. Many of them are out there saying stuff. Some of it's good, some of it's bad. She, by the way, has sort of blotted her notebook since she did the report on parental alienation by saying controversial things about trans kids and so on and Palestine and Israel. I mean, she's a controversial character, as it turns out. But this was one of her first reports, and she wrote this very lengthy document saying, parental alienation is a pseudoscience. It is being used by abusive fathers to get custody of their children. This was the radical feminist spokesperson. And one of the things that I, as an academic, do when I get a document, I read it, and then I read the footnotes. And one of the things is she attacks very directly Gardner. Gardner is terrible. Well, Gardner's been dead for almost 20 years. And then she says, and Burnett hasn't done a much better job. And then, well, have you talked about Janet Johnson or Joan Kelly? No footnotes to any of those people in the middle. It's just, she sets up a bunch of arguments and rejects them. And I think her report, in my view, and the view of many, was highly problematic. But it is cited. Look, the United Nations has spoken, and everyone respects the United Nations, so that's that. And I think the report is highly problematic, both academically and otherwise. And in fairness, the PSAG, which I sort of was they've done a really nice critique of that report that's on the internet. It was a very problematic document, but politically, this sounds very persuasive. The United Nations has said this, and especially in Canada, we don't reject the United Nations. Maybe the Americans do, but we're a United Nations country. So it's a big, and in fact, a year and a half ago, January of 2024, NAL, the National Association of Women in the Law, and those are the people that I was on this issue combating. And I want to say NAL has some wonderful people, and I support their views about a lot of issues like abortion or whatever. Maybe you agree or disagree, but I disagree with their position on this one. But they advocated a ban on parental alienation in the family courts. They say the federal government should amend the Divorce Act. Look, we have American states that have enacted Cadence law. We have the United Nations, which has spoken about this. And we have a lot of research that says parental alienation is a hoax. It is harmful. Parliament should enact legislation to end it. So NAL came out very strong, and 250 feminist organizations signed up to this. Now, it turns out, a little sort of secret here, not secret, but about the reality. How do you get 250 feminist organizations to sign up for something? You say, oh, you know what? We have about 25 positions we want to take on different issues. Everybody sign the next 25 pieces of paper that come by, and then we'll have a strong voice. Don't even, and it turned out some of them were very committed to this, but others, it was like, yeah, that's part of being the feminist team. That's what we do. And in fact, I was speaking to some feminist groups that had signed that, and I said, because I was speaking about family violence, and I said, well, why'd you sign that, or what's your view about the, oh, I didn't even know we signed it. We just, so it doesn't take much to get some people to sign a petition, it turns out. But NAL itself was very committed, and I mean, it's not a secret. They have their executive director, Suzanne Zakour, Dr. Suzanne Zakour, doctor of law, by the way, not a psychologist, who wrote a thesis at Oxford about this. This is her issue, and I've debated her. That's where we're coming to. So I've debated NAL in a number of contexts, and the result of this is I get sort of, calling it hate mail is too strong, but certainly emails, X, I'm one of the people, by the way, when you want to get a professor, what do? You write to the professor and say, you shouldn't be, but you say, I'm not going to stop with you. I'm going to write to the dean. He should be fired, right? I mean, fortunately, the law dean everywhere, but at Queen's says, get law, you have a concern, take it to whoever. But so I was getting on, and you are harming women and children. And you have faith in judges in Canada. Judges are corrupt, and so on. And so, don't ever let Nick Bala speak to your organization. So it's a good thing. I mean, it speaks to PSAG. They're prepared to hear from me. But I was getting a lot of flack from this, and I mean, you make it sound like these are people who are colleagues, and some of them can be quite disagreeable. But the concerns of NAL, as I mentioned, and there's a whole genre of literature. So it's not just the UN Special Rapporteur. There is a large literature. There are articles, books, groups, and so those who are involved in this area and professional know that there's a large group out there, and that says parental alienation is a junk science. Now, it's certainly true that there are limitations to all the research. So on the PSAG, we have thousands of articles. Each study, and I've been involved in some studies, is challenged. It's an extremely difficult area to do social science research, to get a random sample of people or to show something is effective. So one of the critiques is, and we have Yvonne Parnell's program, which I think is very good. Family Bridges is not perfect for everybody, but it's a good program. They say, well, you haven't done a double-blind, random-controlled study, and which means, COVID vaccine, which is, I personally believe in it. What we did is we have, millions of people, and we give them the vaccine, and then there's some of them that we don't get the vaccine, and let's see what happens. Well, the people who got the vaccine, none of them die from the vaccine, apparently, but they are much more likely, the ones who didn't get it, they get sick and die. So this looks like that's a double-blind study. And even that, by the way, of course, now, if you're Robert F. Kennedy, that's junk science too. I mean, junk science is in the eye of the beholder a little bit, but you're never going to be close to anything like that in this area. So that's a true limitation. Doesn't mean, as a judge, you have to do something in this case, and so you do the best you can with the evidence that's there. I think it's a valid observation, but it's not a reason for calling it junk science. And indeed, almost all the work in this area, so you heard a word about coercive control or intimate partner violence. Coercive control, I won't go into the details of it, but there are many people, largely women, who are in a relationship with a partner who is both physically abusive, but also emotionally demeaning, controlling. And the effects of that may well continue long after separation. So coercive control, important idea, now recognized in Canadian law, legislation, family legislation, but there's no instrument that can tell you whether or not someone's been a victim of coercive control. So you just, it's, how do we decide? We hire an expert who says, I think this person's been a victim of coercive control, and the judge will decide. certainly, and related then is a concern, well, that parental alienation is used by dishonest, abusive men to respond to a claim of intimate partner violence and to cover up for child sexual abuse. And I want to say sometimes that happens. In other words, sometimes people who have been abusive say, the reason my children don't want to see me is not because I've been abusive, but because my former partner is alienating the kids. So there are false claims of parental alienation. And it turns out there are also false claims of intimate partner violence, false claims of child sexual abuse, false claims of everything. I mean, and in that sense, I agree with Dr. Fiddler. We often, and whoever we is, don't know what the reality of a situation is. The judges don't know until they've heard all the evidence. And there is uncertainty. That's a challenge. And I'll come back and talk about the research in a moment. Noll says, well, judges in Canada are inherently biased against women. That's another unproven assertion, by the way. I mean, it's impossible that's junk science. Who knows? How do you decide whether judges are biased? And I should say in Canada today, family cases, most of the judges are women. Okay, so whatever you think is, it's not men being biased against women. It's like, well, and then there's a lot of concern about custody reversal. And custody reversal is something I'll talk about, important idea, but it's actually not the most common response. So some research that we did, and this is all available on the internet for free. Among other things, we, with Dr. Birnbaum and a student, we looked at parental alienation cases that went to trial. So, and the time period, by the way, some of them would overlap with some of these cases that were going on. What did the judges say or see when cases were going forward? Well, first of all, they see that sometimes it is the mother who is the victim of alienation. And we actually saw a very nice little kind of demonstration of that. We had 2 men who were victims of alienation, 1 woman. That's probably about the national average in Canada. And the other thing is actually, judges are actually more likely to believe when the woman says, I have been a victim of alienation. They actually consider women more credible on this than men. A lot of the cases involve these conflicting claims. Dad says, you're alienating the kids from me. Mom says, I'm not alienating them. You were abusive of me and or the kids. Over half of the cases are these conflicting claims. If a judge finds in a decision that there's been parental alienation, well, I'll talk about this more in a moment, but the judge does not always reverse custody. These were reverse custody cases, the most dramatic, the most intrusive, the ones that go on forever. But many cases can be resolved without that level of intrusion. And custody reversal, again, most commonly it would be mom to dad, but sometimes it's dad to mom. And some of those alienating dads are also abusive of their partners. They're abusive men. So what happens when there are conflicting evaluation, when there are conflicting claims, as there are in a lot of these cases? And I should say, how do the judges resolve these? Well, one thing they have is experts. So someone like Dr. Harris is appointed under Section 30 of the Children's Law Reform Act, and there's similar legislation in every jurisdiction. A court-appointed person goes and interviews the kids, observes the parents, looks at their records, and so on. It's a long process and can be quite expensive. But those reports are used in about half the cases that we've had, and the judge almost always, or 80% of the case, when that psychologist comes back and says, you're an expert in this area, I'm going to rely on what you said. Not always. Another thing that happens, and we heard about this, child welfare can be involved, child protection services, children's aid societies, they're involved in a lot of cases. The police are involved. And I should say the easier cases are ones where the police say, you know what, we believe that dad has been physically abusive of mom, or dad has been sexually abusive of the child, and we've taken this to criminal court, and we've got a conviction. Okay, then the police act. Okay, but a lot of the cases, actually, we heard, they're much grayer. The police are called, they come and meet the people, they decide not to lay charges, they don't know what's going on, or they lay a charge, it's withdrawn, it's stayed, and it's very hard to know what's going on. One of the problems that Null has, and when I'm sort of cranked up, I say this to them, like when I meet Suzanne Zakor, do you believe that women ever lie? Okay. And in fact, there's actually research about this, and it turns out, who knew, women lie just about as much as men about in life in general. Women are not inherently more honest. Having said that, if a woman is reporting that they've been physically abused, for example, then the context really matters. If you sit in a hospital emergency ward and a woman is coming in and has a black eye, and the doctor says, "What happened?" and she says, "My husband hit me," you don't have many women lying in that particular context. But if you're in family court, there's probably a bit more dishonesty. Having said that, I know that a lot of women who are coming to family court have been victims of family violence, and they're telling the truth. And it may be hard to prove their case. So proving cases, a lot of these cases, it's not that judges don't believe in alienation or don't believe in family violence. They say, I don't know what happened, and all I have is he said, she said. And so for sure, the role of lawyers like Brian Hall is, can I get evidence here? Were there pictures taken? Was someone recording this on their phone? Were there neighbors? That would be best. Your mother, as the victim, is helpful, but not so good. Like if the person who's coming to court to testify on your behalf is your parent, you're a parent, the grandparent, that's helpful, but not as helpful because you're inherently considered biased. So these are very difficult cases. And I certainly want to emphasize that when a judge says, I'm not satisfied that this woman was abused or this child was abused, Dr. Fiddler would say, we don't really know what happened. And the judge doesn't say, I have godlike powers, I know what happened. The judge says, based on the evidence that the parties or their lawyers have presented to me, I am not satisfied that abuse occurred. In some cases, the judge goes further and says, I believe this woman has made a false allegation. And I believe that because Child Protection has investigated her allegations of sexual abuse 12 times, and they've always dismissed it. And the police have dismissed it, and I think she's making it up. And she may be making it up. It's not, if you're a psychologist, you say, well, she's suffered trauma in her childhood and she's personality disordered. So it's not a moral statement, but it is a reality statement. So these are challenging cases. And then we get, how do courts respond to allegations of parental alienation? And there are a range of ways they respond. Most often in Ontario or in Canada, they say, we're just going to have more, we're going to order more time to the rejected parent. Sometimes they order community-based counseling. And this is a point that was sort of lost a little bit in the first. There are, if you want, at least two different kinds of counseling. There's counseling when the judge says, I'm ordering the children go from mom to dad, and dad should take the kids to Family Bridges. And that's perfectly valid. That's sort of post-court order reunification counseling to help the child adjust to the change in parenting. But in many cases, the judge says, or the parents may agree, we're going to have counseling in the community, and the child will continue to go back and forth between mom and dad, and both parents will see the counselor, a counseling team. And that can often work. It doesn't always work, sort of so-called family systems approach, but that can be very useful, and that's the least traumatic for everybody. Can you restore that way? And Dr. Fiddler sometimes gets involved in that. It's challenging, by the way, but it's possible. And that's where you need a detailed stipulated order. Sometimes, by the way, the judge says, I don't think I can do anything here. The parents give up. And I think giving up is too harsh. They recognize that it's not in their child's best interest right now to continue with the litigation process. And they say, I want my child to know that I love them and that I'm prepared to establish a relationship when they're ready for it, but I'm not going to continue to litigate because it's just putting my child in the middle, and or I don't have $100,000, $200,000. So custody reversal certainly happens, but it takes a lot of resources, takes a lot to prove it to the court. I should say courts in Canada are getting a little better about doing this somewhat more quickly. In some of the cases, it used to take 10 years before the courts would do it. Now we're down to 2 years, and I think that's doing well. And it's a complicated decision, but, is Yvonne here? No. Oh, yes. Oh, sorry. Yeah, so I believe in her program. I don't believe it's a perfect program, but it works with a lot of people who have, the resources to afford it. But many people can't afford it. Sometimes the judge has some reversing custody, and the parent has to figure out what they're going to be doing. And I should say that, I did it with Rachel Birnbaum. We did a really, I think, interesting piece of research that was unique, well, probably unique in the world. Most of the research, so what Yvonne and others have done, Richard Warshak, they study cases that they have, what happens to the case they have. We kind of did it the other way around. We went and looked at cases that had been decided where the court made a custody reversal, whether sending it to Family Bridges or not, and tried to find the kids 20 years later, or 10 years later. What happened to you after the judge said you should reverse custody? And it was very hard to find kids and got to parents, but we did find 6 kids out of 67 cases, and all the kids were doing well. Okay, now compared to what? But they said, the kids were saying, when this happened 4 or 8 or 10 years ago, I was opposed. I said, I don't want to go and live with Dad. I'm happy with Mom. Dad is terrible, but the judge made me go anyway. And I'm doing well now. And in fact, unfortunately, in all the case that was, that we had, they weren't actually seeing the formally favored parent, the alienating mother. Not because Dad was saying, you don't ever want to see her. To the contrary, Dad would be kind of supportive. But many of the parents who were alienating dropped out of the situation. Once they lost custody, they said, that judge was wrong. I give up on this system. And of course, it's very hard for anybody, but if you're in a family case and the judge says, I don't believe you, or I don't think you're credible enough, and says, I'm going to do something else, some people say, in that case, I'm giving up. And I know Yvonne, when she'll do her presentation, it's hard for her to get those parents back in, but she has some success in doing that. I think that's great to try to do that, but recognize on some level as a judge, you're dealing with a case, you may be choosing between one parent and the other, not because, but because one parent might drop out. So, my response in a lot of the discussion that was going on, how was this actually resolved in Canada? In the United States, they'd have legislative hearings, but in Canada, we had, members of the Department of Justice would sort of talk to people quietly and sort of, because, for a moment, the feminist groups were in Parliament Hill with signs, and then the bureaucrats in the Department of Justice started phoning around. And of course, they were phoning judges a lot, and judges said, you can trust us, we're doing our best with these cases. And I basically said, in various conversations with people in justice, basically, in my view, in this country, we can trust the judges. Doesn't mean the judges are always right, but I trust the judges more than the politicians, if you want. I think that we should need a case-by-case basis. Let's bring in Dr. Harris, let people do their best. Let's bring in Brian Hall and decide this on a case-by-case basis, not ban parental alienation as a concept. And that argument was successful in Canada. I mean, that it was, went to the government, and the government did not accept the position of null. And I should say, for those of you in recent Canadian political history, this was when we had the Trudeau government, the Trudeau Liberals, and there was a concern that they were kind of wobbling. I don't think with the Carney Liberals, let alone with Poilievre, that we're going to see this issue come back for a while. But it's certainly an ongoing issue in various countries. So as I pointed out, in Canada, in most American states, we let the judges decide. I want to say, by the way, and this is a nationalistic moment, I think we have, on the whole, very good judges in Canada. It doesn't mean they always get it right. I'm a little more, when someone in the United States says, well, who's your judge there? Well, it was the person who was elected the favorite, and whether it's Republican, Democrat, who had been the, donating money to the party, and they were elected judge. Maybe some of them are not the best judges in the world, but that's, but there's certainly variation around the world. So if you're interested in reading it, the European Court on Human Rights has given a very strong recommendation, affirmation of parental alienation, so really strong support. But on the other hand, the German Constitutional Court has prohibited evidence of parental alienation in in a decision a couple of years ago, which I personally, of course, I read the Google translation, but it seemed very problematic to me, and people in Germany are very concerned. The UK Family Justice Council, are the people here from UK? Nobody here from UK? Oh, yes. Oh, of course. Well, so yes, Dr. McCartan has to live with that document. Okay. So, what do I think? Well, by way of conclusion, I have a number of recommendations, but I'm getting the signal because I want to make sure there's time. I certainly support, as we said here, the need for case management, for example, and we need to keep parental alienation as a useful concept